My name is Carolyn Young. We're going to get the webinar started now. I'm glad that you've all been able to make it. This is our second webinar in a series called Your Standards, Your Say. We're doing, OCO and COG are doing a series of webinars to engage people in this year's Organic Standards Review process. So just to go over a few things, make sure that your audio and video are both turned off. We want to minimize the amount of background noise. So we will open it up for discussion and everyone will get a chance to ask questions. But if you have a question in the meantime, feel free to use this little chat button that you should see in your, either at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen. It has this little icon. And we'll try and answer your questions as they come on. Kristen Howe is here in the background, and she'll be able to answer some chats. I also wanted to inform everyone that we will be recording this call, and we'll be trying to share that with all the participants and also more broadly. So we hope that you're okay with that. Also, if you have any trouble participating, we did give some contact information for Zoom, and you should be able to call in there or follow the instructions there to get connected. So, without further ado, I wanted to introduce the panelists and the agenda for today. My name is Carolyn Young. I'm the Executive Director of the Organic Council of Ontario, and we have just completed a small-scale consultation process in coordination with the regulation that we've been pushing for here in Ontario, and we wanted to share some of those findings, so we'll start off with that. Then we have Rochelle Eisen, who is a member of many things, but also lives in BC and has a lot of experience with the small scale, thinking about regulations in terms of the province and also in terms of inclusion for small scale producers. Cameron Dale is here with us from Everdale Brickworks, where the farmers market there has been conducting a bit of a pilot project for vendors at their farmers market to be peer reviewed both on the organic level, but on other certifications as well. Tony McQuail, a longtime organic farmer and also an advocate for small-scale certification solutions. He was part of the Organic Federation of Canada's small-scale working group and gave recommendations there. Finally, Dave Lockman here from ProCert Organic. We'll talk about ProCert's local organic program and also some of the challenges and opportunities of the national regime in light of small scale. Then we'll open it up for discussion and as well as questions and answers. And at that time, there's lots of opportunities to ask questions about the review process, changes to the standards that you would like to see for small-scale producers, as well as the regulatory piece. So I will go on next. So just a quick overview. Many of you already know this, but in Canada we have what is a set of regulations that manage our standards. So the Canada Organic Standards are a set of principles and practices that are written down and were created by the industry and for the industry, and are linked to and are regulated by now what's called the Safe Food for Canadians regulation, soon, but also previously were the organic products regulations. So they are, this diagram is a little bit binary. This process is a little bit more intricate than it seems here, but basically the regulations are overseen by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, but they delegate most of the activities that are involved in certification to conformity verification bodies, which are private or nonprofit entities that oversee and accredit certifying bodies. And certifying bodies, as you know, are also private and nonprofit entities that inspect and certify operators. But we also have a standards interpretation committee that gives input to all of these entities. The Standards Interpretation Committee is a group of experts on organic who help to clarify any inconsistencies in the standards in between reviews. And we have what's called the Committee on Organic Agriculture, the technical committee that is involved in the review process and voting on changes to the standards every 5 years. That Organic Technical Committee is made up of a number of associations, one of which is the Organic Federation of Canada. And the Organic Federation of Canada's role is really to have representatives from across the industry and across the country who are involved in the process of creating the standards. They create organic working groups on different subjects, and those working groups give recommendations to the technical committee on changes of the standards. I'm sure that I'm missing things, and I'm hoping that I'm explaining things correctly. I have a number of experts on the panel here who can make suggestions to things that I might have missed, but I'm just trying to go quickly through this. So, as I mentioned, in Canada, our standards are referred to by the regulations. What that means is that we have a set of standards that can change. They don't have to go through regulatory change in order to be changed. They are a separate document, and they adhere to the International Standards Organization, ISO, guidelines, which has a whole set of standards for standards, if you will. So how standards should be maintained and kept up, and how they should be set out and developed. But so the standards outline the principles, but the regulations enforce the standards. There's a difference here between Canada and the US in that the US actually have their standards embedded in their regulations, which means that the government oversees those, whereas here in Canada, our standards are separate from the regulations, which means that industry has more say. We can go into that a bit more later. But one of the questions people ask is, why do they need to be updated? Well, obviously there are changes constantly to the organic industry, but also it's something that is mandated by the Canadian General Standards Board, which is where our standards are located. So CGSB, and our standards would be archived if they weren't reviewed every 5 years. So it's mandated that we have to review them every 5 years. And the CGSB oversees that review process, and they're a revenue neutral Crown agency, which means that they require money for the review process and the updates to the standards. So we're obligated to review and update our standards, and we're also obligated to pay for that. But it's also important that we do update the standards for many reasons: to clarify ambiguities, to deal with challenges in implementation and changes to the industry, as well as discrepancies. So OCO is involved in this work primarily as a representative on the Organic Federation of Canada and as a voting member on the technical committee. And the general overview process, we're aiming to have a reviewed standard and updated standard by 2020, but the proposals for modifications have already been accepted in July of 2018. And OFC is in the process of creating working groups to review those proposals and make recommendations. And the CGSB committee will be meeting from October to March 2019. And they will be voting on proposed modifications. And those proposed modifications will also be submitted for public comment. So there'll be lots of opportunities to give input on the review process. But also I encourage you, if you have modifications that you haven't had a chance to give a proposal on, to feel free to reach out to OCO, Simon Jacques, or Nicole at the Organic Federation of Canada to give your input. So finally, I want to get on to what OCO has been working on. So this webinar is specifically focused on small scale. And the reason why OCO is particularly interested in this is that we have been working here in Ontario on getting an organic regulation. So as many of you know, we have regulations at a national level that require operators to be certified to our organic standards, but those regulations only apply for products that are traded in between provinces or across borders, or that bear the Canada Organic logo. But within the province of Ontario, any products that are traded within province do not currently require certification. And this leads to all kinds of challenges that we won't get into, but also we won't get into too much. Many of you have heard about this before. OCO does have a whole site dedicated to our provincial organic regulation and why we're advocating for that. But in advocating for that, we're also interested in making sure that we're not excluding or pricing out organic producers who are too small to afford or have issues with certifying. So that's why we're looking at some of the small scale solutions. But as we were looking at some of the small scale solutions that could apply in Ontario, one thing that has come up is that why aren't we doing this at a national level? And so I think there are two pieces to this webinar. We're looking at solutions that could be implemented locally by a farmer's market, for example, but also provincially within the province of Ontario, or federally. As we look at our standards review process, are there ways to change our regulations or our standards? And those are two separate things, but I'm sure we'll get a little bit more into that later on. So as part of this, we've done a survey and held focus groups and developed a white paper that I'm going to share the results with you on. So who did we survey? We surveyed 94 organic stakeholders, the majority of which were producers, 73%. There were a few others. We've tried to keep the corresponding answers primarily to producers, since those are the ones who are most often affected by certification regulations. But we were very lucky to see that many of them were small-scale producers, actually. So 40% were not certified organic, 30% were certified. These are of the producers who responded. 15% were in transition and 10% had been certified in the past. 79% of those were CSA or direct marketers, or did some portion of their sales through CSA and direct marketing, and 42% had less than $20,000 annually. So I think we captured, hopefully, some of the voices that we were hoping to capture in this study. Oops, go back. Oh, I can't go back. There we go. So one of the questions we asked was, do you support organic regulation in the province of Ontario, in principle, at least? And 81% expressed support for regulating the term organic, at least in principle. 77% of those producers were producer respondents, 73% were CSA producers, 69% non-certified producers, and 46% of non-certified producers under 20,000. So really the group that had the least amount of support for this were those in the under 20,000 category who weren't certified. Which makes a lot of sense. So, you know, when we asked about this, many started to talk about what they meant by supporting it. So we heard things like, organic products should mean certified. If they are beyond organic, they should still certify to prove it. I believe in regulating the term in principle, but it depends on how the term organic is defined. The current environment is confusing for consumers, and it also creates a disincentive for producers to certify because they have no need for direct marketing selling. This leaves a huge gap in who is certified and leaves room for practices that would not align with the current organic standard. So we've tried to give a couple of different quotes from either side in each case. I do agree that the term should be regulated. However, those of us growing following the organic standard who cannot afford the cost of certification could be penalized, even though we are following and often exceeding the requirements of the standard. It is unfair the cost of certification is prohibitive and that we could be penalized for advertising our products as organic, which they are. So a little bit of both. People agree with it, but they don't want to see it really be prohibitive. We asked people about a grace period. We know that in BC, for example, the the term organic regulations came into place about 3 years ago, but implementation is only just happening. So there's been a 3-year grace period, I believe. Rochelle will speak to this in a minute, I hope. But we asked, should there be a grace period? And most people said yes. 33% said it wouldn't be that important. And most people agreed that 3 years was enough time. Again, certification challenges, we've asked this many times before, but again, it always comes up. The top challenges are cost and burden of paperwork. Of course, there are other issues like it can be too expensive for diversified farms. Organic standards don't communicate values of beyond organic. Non-certified businesses undercut those who are certified, and it's too difficult to navigate. Regulations are too restrictive. So mostly, everybody agrees with the expensive part, although I'm not sure how many people know how much it actually costs. And I think it depends on the size and scale of the farm. We did actually, as part of this survey, ask about, or in another survey that we did, ask about the expensive certification. And we found that most farms of a certain scale, of a smaller scale, were under, with the revenues under 100,000, were at $900 annually, and a good majority of those were under $600 annually. So we're looking at, and that, and depends what the threshold is for each farm. We're looking at, $500 to $900 for small scale entrants. So the reason we came here today, we presented our survey respondents with a whole bunch of possible solutions that we could implement in Ontario. One was peer review and participatory guarantee system, wherein producers or other operators would go and inspect each other and decide on certification as a group. There's a lot of different variations of what this looks like, but for the most part, it means farmers are certifying farmers, or businesses are certifying businesses to some degree. It can also mean a collective version, like a cooperative version. So in some places, for example, Mexico, coffee producers will form a co-op, and there will be spot inspections in addition to internal inspections. So an external inspector would come and do spot inspections, but there would be an internal inspection process in the cooperative. Tends to be used more often in the global south. Another option is the idea of a self-declaration or a pledge. There again are many different versions of this. Self-declaration could mean that you have to undergo training, that perhaps you are still subject to inspection, maybe a certain amount of surprise inspections, that you would have to be listed in a directory and still be held to a certain level of punitive issues if you are found to be not in compliance. So this self-declaration pledge model could be a variety of versions to be made more or less rigorous, but the idea is mostly that farmers declare and sign some sort of pledge that commits them to the organic standards and principles. The low-risk designation solution, mostly this means people who have been found to be in compliance for 3 years, at least 3 years, can then be qualified as a low-risk entity and be inspected less frequently and at a lower cost. Financial and logistics supports, so subsidies for certification or help navigating the process, perhaps an online form, for example, or assistance. Third-party approaches to small-scale certification, that's what we pretty much have already, although the local organic program that ProCert offers is one that isn't compliant with the Canada Organic regime, but allows farmers to be ready to step up to a certification at a national level if they decide to trade outside of the province. So it's basically a provincial designation. And then, of course, changing national regulations to include small scale and or low risk designations is the final option. We asked people about this, and there were kind of mixed reviews, and I think that this has a lot to do with people's understandings or mixed understandings of the different approaches. So, for example, the peer review solution, there were, again, I think, mixed reviews. Farmers know each other best and are able to judge compliance, but at the same time, they might not have peers in their area. Not all farmers are close in proximity, and they may, it might be source of conflict between producers. Also, there's a question about rigor. Is that enough accountability for the public? On the other hand, the pledge system, sorry, I'll move this quickly. So the low risk program seems like a good compromise because you have to be fully certified, but then maybe let lower inspections after the first 3 years. But some people think this might be confusing to consumers. The pledge system, generally speaking, people thought this wasn't a great idea, but it sounds like some might not know exactly what it means. People think it's not rigorous enough, might not be enough accountability for consumers, might be too cumbersome, and it could be easily manipulated. And long-term farmers don't want to have to take a mandatory training. The supports, so logistical and financial supports, had a strong support for this. Of course, it's harder to get financial support. That might have to come from government or an association like OCO that would have to fundraise for it. But this does exist in places like New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. I think the subsidy support would be paired with a low-cost certification option for small farms going direct to consumer and with provincial sales would be good. I suggest that funding be available for technical and extension support, and this be available for the first 3 years. The problem is that certifying agents raise their prices costs because they know that you are being subsidized. That was one concern that came out. Yeah, in general, the other idea of third-party programs or national changes were supported. People don't want to weaken the standards, but they want to make sure that the context for small and large scale farmers are all included. But I don't think they know exactly what that means. And either a farm is organic or it isn't, just confusing to have various types of certification. That was a common theme. So overall, in general, people ranked direct support, such as subsidies and logistical and extension supports, as the most popular solution, with low risk designation coming second and changes to federal regulations coming third. That being said, we are still in the final stages of finalizing our report, and we'd love to hear from our panelists on what they think are the best solutions for Ontario and for Canada, and as well as those who are attending the webinar. We also asked if there were going to be a special small-scale program, what would be the criteria for determining what small-scale means? Is it revenue? Is it marketing channels, size, diversity of products, or geographic range? And generally speaking, people felt revenue was the best indicator because marketing channels changed depending on their where they were in the province, and usually there was a combination of direct sales as well as restaurant and wholesale. And acreage changes with products, for example. We also asked what would incentivize you to use a program like this? Many people said access to funding and a small-scale brand, although we asked about a small-scale brand and the Foodland Organic logo, and more people preferred a small-scale brand. So I'm not sure exactly what that means, except that there were a couple comments that said that Foodland was not the right brand for organic. We asked about compliance with regulations. That was less of an incentive than those carrots versus sticks. So our final recommendations in that report, and I've gone a little bit over time here, we're basically to address the cost of certification for small-scale farmers and operators, to explore the potential of a low-risk program in Ontario, to consider reviewing the COR guidelines for small-scale, and additional technical, administrative, and training supports. I think we're still open to some other possibilities and recommending those to government, and we hope to hear from our panelists on their thoughts as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to, stop share, turn this over to Rochelle and ask her a few questions. So let's make sure that Rochelle gets unmuted. Here we go. Hi, Rochelle.
Now. Yes, I can do that, Caroline. I can push a button. So good. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Rochelle. So first of all, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how the system in BC currently works and a little bit of the history of how we've gotten to the place where you're at.
Okay, that's a very large question. So trying to bundle it in small bite-sized bites. What it is in BC's always had a provincial regulation. It's had it for before the year 2000, and it was a voluntary system. And we know that a lot of people in the province sell directly to consumers. So we were looking for options for operators who weren't selling across the outside of the province. And we also have our own accreditation system under COABC. So the accreditation board that serves as the conformity verification body for CFIA also has oversight over all the certification bodies. So we knew we could set up something that was an alternative that could help reduce costs, direct costs for farmers in terms of inspections. So we came up with a reduced frequency pattern, which gets called low risk. And what it means is operators who sell directly within the province of British Columbia, who are good performers, who have had no compliance, who've been in certification for 3 years, have a reduced frequency of inspections, but they have to submit their renewal application every year. And if the renewal application shows that there's no changes in terms of the management system, they get a reduced cost because they don't have to pay for the cost of inspection. So there's a desk review of their file, and if there's changes in their management plan or their organic plan, or if they've expanded, they go back into the regular system where they get inspected that year. So it's only if the system's the same and they're not changing practices. And they're also put in a pool. All these people who are low risk are inspected. There's 10% of them get inspected annually. So there is oversight. So there's the desk review of the file. 10% get unannounced inspections. So they don't even know the VO is coming, the verification officer is coming. So it really it's fulsome. It actually does. It's a robust system that actually does give oversight, and they're paying for the cost of the renewal. They're just not getting hit with the cost of inspection. And cost of inspection has to cover expenses of the verification officer, which involves travel. And so when you have people spread out across provinces like we do in BC, with all our mountains and everything like that, your costs for getting VOs out to remote areas is high. So therefore the cost, it could be quite a significant saving. And then they're inspected every 3rd year anyway. So you only get the saving for 2 years running. And then you're back in the pool, you're reassessed again, there's a site inspection, and then if you qualify again for low risk, then you'll be put back into the low risk pool for 2 years. How's that sound? Does that help, Caroline?
And do you know what the general costs are, or can you give a
Well, it depends on the certifiers, because we have 2 different groups of certifiers in British Columbia. We have those that are ISO accredited with CFIA oversight, and then we also have certification bodies that are regionally accredited under the same accreditation board, but they don't have the ISO structure. And ISO is really about structure. It's not about the standards. So they're assessed to the same standard. Their paperwork might not be as dense as ISO's certification systems, but they have to deal with all the same requirements of the standard. They have to have records. They have to have everything that's required in the organic standard. So I can't speak to it, but at one point, I believed that certification could be half the price under the regional program, because the cost of delivering ISO certification is really in the administrative costs of delivering the program. And probably, I hope, Dave, can you nod if you know if that's correct? Oh, unmute yourself and say something, and I'm going to bring him in because he probably can speak to this. You're still muted. Hold on.
There you go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So what was the exact question?
So Dave, now that you've done this group of low risk, don't you think the cost of the administrative costs of ISO are where the costs really are?
Yeah, there's a lot of costs related to the ISO. Like our program is not ISO.
Can you
You're
just,
low risk, right? But yeah.
I just want to make sure that everybody understands what you mean when you say ISO. I gave a little bit of an overview, but International Standards Organization.
It's a procedural process.
Yeah.
It's a procedural process, and it's the requirement so we can sustain our country-to-country trade agreements and trade outside of provinces. So it just is, I'm going to say a terrible word, it's a bureaucracy of a systematic process that allows for equivalencies to be assessed and structure to be assessed when you're being audited. In the regional program that we have in BC, it's non-ISO, so your costs are less because the administrative costs of delivering the certification are reduced. Doesn't mean that they're not fulsome, it's just they don't have to meet the rigor of an ISO system. So that's why I'm saying, I believed at one point it was half the cost.
And
Okay?
those ISO procedural standards are, they're for standards other than organic. They're for industrial standards throughout the world, right? So
oh yeah. And there's millions of ISO standards, okay, and regulations, and they're all specific. So you see, organic certification bodies have to function under 17011. I think I can't. No, accreditation boards have to be 17011. Certification bodies have to be 17065. And so these again, another set of criteria that the structure has to meet. That's it. So that's why we came up with two systems, because people who ship only within the province didn't need that administrative burden.
Right. So I'm going to ask you a little bit about, I know that you also authored a COABC small scale certification report. Can you talk a little bit about what other solutions you were looking at there and what kind of feedback you got? I know it's, again, a big question, but.
Oh, another huge question. Again, it sort of reiterated the fact that low risk is a good model to use. At one point, we were talking about maybe certifying the farmer versus the products. That didn't go over really well after a while because it didn't fit in with the regulation, the federal regulation, and it would have meant that people were calling themselves organic and products were calling themselves organic, and really who was better. So that one didn't go through. We looked at the PGS Participatory Guaranteed System, which is endorsed by IFOAM and has some oversight through the IFOAM system if the PGS actually applies for it. Again, the peer review, the declaration, we looked at that, and again, everybody who is certified said, no way, everybody's got to do the same thing we're doing, or they cannot use the same claim we're using. They can't use the core logo, they can't use that. Because we've jumped these hoops, everybody has to jump these hoops. But you know what, the low risk, we can tolerate that because they're within our systems and they're getting inspected. So yeah, we did a lot of work and we came back to the same solution we already have.
So one question I had about the low risk program is that I think a lot of you see, for example, there's I feel like there's two categories of farmers who aren't certifying, if we're looking specifically at small scale farmers. One is, I've just started, I'm just getting off my feet, on my feet. I don't know yet if I have a market. I don't know if I have enough revenue. I want to establish things before I certify. and then maybe they get a little bit further and like, well, I actually don't really have to certify, so maybe I won't do it. And I think that there's another group of farmers who maybe are certifying for a certain amount of time. They establish their markets, and then they realize they don't actually need to certify that much either. Maybe they get frustrated with the bureaucracy. Maybe their market isn't really meeting it, and so they drop the certification. So there's, in both cases, it's sort of a business question as well as, if I don't need to do it, why would I do it? I think the low risk category maybe helps with this one category of producer that's already gone through the process, but maybe doesn't help with the category of producer that is trying to get established and you're trying to bring them into the certification system.
Yeah, and that's probably where you need funding to help those new people. But again, that funding to help people transition, to defer their certification costs, got slammed in the small scale report in BC because they're going, existing operators went, I paid for my certification costs. Why should somebody else get subsidized? So you can't irritate everybody who's already in the pool. And I've been calling it a tent. There's those that are in the tent and those who are out of the tent who want to be in the tent but don't want to pay to be in the tent. And we need to move the tent poles out. That's basically what I'm saying. We need everybody in the tent. We got to find a way. So new growers, all I try to say to people is, look, the cost of certification is quite inexpensive. I think around, if you're in close proximity, some of the certifiers in BC could deliver for $400 to $500. Okay, so that's not a huge expense. And when you look at the education process that new farmers get by exposure to verification officers and certification systems, because the standards are dense, and if they don't get in on the right floor, they're never going to understand these standards, because requirements, people say, oh, rotation. Yeah, I have a rotation. Yeah, but do you have a fulsome rotation? Is it actually really any good? Is it actually building soil? These are the points you have when you have a relationship with the certification body. Not that the verification officer can act as an advisor. We all know that. And just reiterate it, verification officer can't consult, but just them asking those questions, those people looking at your organic system, will give you quite a good hint on where you're missing out and not complying with the standards. Because too many times when people say, I'm organic, they are organic because they're not maybe using a prohibited substance. But are they really doing the positive things of organic, where they're actually building soil, where they're building the soil on farm, which is embedded in our standard. Our standard says you need to be generating your soil building capacity on farm, which means you cannot be dependent on off-farm inputs. So off-farm inputs can only supplement. So if you are not reading the standard, you're not being assessed, you miss these nuances. So if you want to call yourself organic, then I say step up to the plate, because people find the experience eye-opening. Having a verification officer on your farm, because here's somebody who's not judging you as a peer, they're judging you to these standards, so you can confidently call yourself organic, your product's organic, and we know where your opportunities for improvement are. And I'm babbling, so I'm going to stop.
Well, I mean, I think one thing that we're not addressing in this webinar, but that is something that we have been looking at too, is that this idea of a regenerative organic movement, where the Organic 3.0 movement, which is about getting in and then improving within that standard. But that's something that we can talk about a little bit later. I'm curious, Rochelle, since BC is now about to implement regulations, first of all, if you have any thoughts on how many producers and small scale operators in BC are still outside of the certification system, and how many might the regulation actually bring into the fold, might take out of the fold, out of the tent, as you say, by implementing these regulations. That's my question.
Okay, I don't know the exact numbers, because until the bodies show up, we don't know. And the regulation just became implemented September 1st, 2018. So it's 4 days old. So I haven't heard of anybody being arrested or charged in the last 4 days. And as far as I understand, and actually I'm looking at a press release just to make sure I say this correctly, the plan from the ministry is to, well, what's the new plan? I had it here. They're going to use education and oversight for a while just to help people identify if they are in not compliance, like that they have to get certification. So even though we've had 3 years since we've announced we're going to full regulation, they're still going to use an educational step-up process for a period longer, just so, which makes sense, which absolutely makes sense. We haven't had a regulation for how long? All of a sudden calling it carte blanche on September 1st would have been not the smartest thing, because you got to give people time to get up to scruff to the requirements. And basically, a lot of these people probably are organic. They just need to apply for certification. And it's September 1st. So how many farmers are going to apply September 1st, even though they should? Because they're talking about next year's certification. So yeah, a bit of a grace period is a good idea.
Great. Well, I do think that we need to move on. I do want to ask you one last question, which is about your provincial accreditation. I think, for example, in Ontario here, we aren't particularly interested in recreating a new accreditation system, but I know that COABC and the certifying bodies within COABC have some lower fees as a result of just doing the regional regulation. Can you just maybe speak to why that is?
Because again, we don't have to bring in a third-party auditor from around the world with ISO credentials to do the witness audits and audits of the ISO CBs. So people within our system can do that oversight on the regional CBs. But really, what we should really talk about is how do we fix this at the federal level? Because you hinted that that could be fixed in regulation, and actually it can't be, because the regulation doesn't talk about process. And CFIA also isn't really addressing intra-provincial, within a province, structures. So somehow or other, I can't see how that can be fixed federally, but it would help that if in the CFIA operating manual, if they actually had a low risk element in there. They have group certification in there, but they don't they don't introduce the concept of risk. And risk can be used as an assessment tool to determine frequency of inspection. And if they embedded that into the CFIA operating manual, it would go a long way to help all the ISO CBs to be able to do assessments on members that are ISO accredited and actually reduce the frequency of inspection based on their assessments. And that would be auditable. So, does that make sense? There was one question in the chat that I probably should have answered, Caroline, before we go on, okay? So the question, I think everybody can see it. You're asking about the frequency, and you know what? I can't remember what happens. So if you get 10%, the question is if you're part of the 10% that gets randomly audited, do you get an extra year of grace? I can't remember. It's a minor thing. And I apologize because I can't remember. So I will look into it and report back to Caroline, and she can share that information. Okay?
Great. Now I'm trying to figure out who's next in our agenda. Tony, is it okay if we call on you next?
Yes, you can call on me. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, did you have a question, or do you want me to just launch in?
No, I was hoping, Tony, you could speak a bit about the process that you went through with the Organic Federation of Canada working groups and the recommendations you gave there, and then also maybe give your thoughts on the findings from the survey so far.
I delete my video.
We can see you.
I'm going to stop my video.
Okay.
So hopefully my audio comes through more clearly. Is that better for audio? Okay. We had a working group with about 6, 7 people participating on it from across the country. And we developed a questionnaire for people and sent it out to through various channels and invited people to fill it in. I think we had around 250 people fill it out. And there were many of the same concerns that were identified in yours. People who felt that the process had become pretty cumbersome, had not been designed for very diversified operations that were sort of more ecologically diverse rather than a few major organic crops. And I think a major concern that I don't think has been identified is the amount of time required for a small scale producer to do paperwork and keep record keeping, and what level that you do that. If you're a CSA market gardener with 40 or 50 different crops, it can be quite a challenge because you're trying to keep production records if they're happening on harvests that are weekly or bi-weekly. So yes, so there were a number of concerns that were raised. In looking at it as a committee, we came up with the peer review certification model or the pledge. And I think there's merit in both of them. I personally get very concerned about people who say, well, I paid my dues, fuck you, pay yours. I think that's the wrong attitude, because I think there are a lot of people out there who feel they're organic, want to be organic in the producer, small scale producer level, who believe in the principles of organic, but we need to figure out ways to invite them in rather than try and make it a closed shop. And I think that things like the self-declaration that has some inspection and teeth with it would be a good way of helping people transition. The other concern that I have as I watch my daughter try and take over our farm is that the time costs of organic certification probably involve a couple of weeks of her time a year, and the financial costs of certification probably involve another couple of weeks of her net income from farming. And those are pretty big costs for someone who's trying to get started. They aren't insignificant or incidental. So coming up with processes that let people work their way in, that maintain the integrity of the standards, while at the same time not having the cost of the system that was designed for international trade and interprovincial trade, seems to me like a wise thing, because my anxiety is that if we're too heavy-handed with it, we will simply send a lot of people elsewhere rather than into the organic tent. And my other concern with the way the system has developed, because I was one of the people in the mid-'80s who was working to try and actually help start the OCIA inspection system in Ontario, is that it's become much more of a policing regulatory process rather than a stimulus to information sharing and growth of knowledge and understanding and improved mimicking of nature and performing in a way that builds soil organic matter and builds farmer knowledge on how to do that. And my anxiety is that a system that is highly regulatory at its best implements what existed or what was thought to be the best practices 2, 3, 5 years ago, and doesn't necessarily stimulate the development of what will be the best practices or the best knowledge a year or two from now. And so those are some of the concerns that I have as I see the process developing, and from the kind of feedback we got from people. One of the things I'd be very interested in, Carolyn, is the 10% of your producer respondents who had been certified and no longer were, were you able to follow up with them and find out why they were no longer certified?
No, but we definitely did include that question in another survey, and often it was a combination of factors that were already identified as barriers, namely cost, time. I don't need it. We have one example, Sokol Organics, that wrote a guest blog on our website that talked about inputs. Inputs is a big issue, and actually I sit on the organic value chain roundtable at the national level. We know that inputs is a major issue in that it's often a burden on producers and operators to figure out which inputs they can use. And if, for example, in the case of Sokol Organics, they hear from their neighbors that they can use a seed in organic, or it's allowed in the States, and they use it, and then they're perhaps they haven't communicated properly with the certifying body or done due diligence, they can lose their certification. So one of the things that we do see as a need is to have more of an ongoing list of approved inputs that's more accessible. Not something that the task force is working on. But I think there is this combination of, I don't need it. My customers, are confident in what I do, and I want to innovate in ways. For example, the paper pot planter is one area that maybe hasn't. There's glue in the paper pots. It's not allowed in the regulations. So, but I want to use that. It seems silly that I can't use it. So those sorts of things I think can be an issue. But I have spent a bit of time thinking about this, and Ontario is a special case in some ways in that we have a very large market for direct marketers here. Our organic sales retail are 1.6 billion. And so there's a lot of agriculture that's close to a large market that leaves some room for this ability to direct market, but also leaves some room for people to exploit a lack of understanding or education. So I don't think that all farmers who aren't certified are not doing 100% organic practices. I think that that's the exception to the rule is the farmer or the business that's maybe manipulating the loophole. But I think most are doing a good job. It's just that we lose track of who they are. We don't know what our sector looks like because we don't have this tent, as Rochelle puts it. So, but one thing I wanted to ask you before we move on, Tony, is about your vision for a pledge system or self-declaration program in somewhere like Ontario or elsewhere. What would you say that should look like if we were to implement something?
Well, in the committee work, we felt that it would be best to have it for the direct marketing sector. We felt that when you're starting to move beyond that, you really do need to have some kind of third-party certification. And for the declaration, we thought a declaration that basically said the person would adhere to the standards, and also had a process by which you did a self-assessment against the standard and looked at what are the things you're producing, identify what areas in the standard apply to it, and your application explain how you're going to meet those, so that it would have the kind of educational component that Rochelle was talking about. Having gone through a number of inspections, Rochelle, I think you have great expectations of your inspectors. It sometimes feels like we're educating them, not them educating us. And they sometimes demonstrate an incredible lack of knowledge about various aspects, but they have a good checklist that they want to check off. I think that encouraging that this could actually be a good educational part, and we liked the Michigan Farmers Pledge and included it, and I'm happy to provide copies of what we produced for people. I don't know if they're still accessible on the Organic Federation of Canada website. I could find the blog when I looked in the last day or two, but I couldn't find the specifics of that. The peer review certification model in many ways was very similar to what Rochelle was describing in BC, in terms of people having to have someone who was a peer who could come and inspect. I don't think there was anything particularly remarkable, except that it would provide, personally, I prefer the self-declaration model. I think it puts some responsibility on the person, provided you have something like some random inspections and a complaint procedure. But I think that it's a good entry point and encourages people to continue in their learning and developing of knowledge through the application process. And then if they expand to a point where they are wanting to sell to restaurants or sell to health food stores or those sorts of things, then they're at a point where, okay, now we need third party. But that it would be a way of moving out the poles and bringing people in to the stage where they're interested, and without with relatively small expense, but a good complaint procedure and some random inspection.
Okay, good. Yes. I would like to hear more, but I think we should move on. I took up a lot of time. One thing that we found in our survey was that we asked about sales channels as well as revenue, and we found that people even in the highest category of revenue also did direct sales. So and then there were comments that, for example, for farms in Northern Ontario, they couldn't just do direct sales, they had to do outside of that. Then I think about things like online sales. So considering that, I'm going to leave this open in a category for discussing later and parking lot it. But there's a question there about who should be considered a direct marketer and how do we create that category. So I'm just going to turn it over to Cameron for now, and then we'll get back to that question hopefully a bit later. Thanks, Tony. So Cameron, I'm just going to pull up your slides. Cameron, I'll just move the slides along for you if that's okay.
If you could drop a couple back.
Yeah. Hold on a second.
Great.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, so hello everyone, anyone who's on the line. I may have had the chance to chat to some of you a few months ago at the last Organic Council conference, which was marvellous. I think that what we're going to talk about today, which is our peer review pilot at Evergreen Brickworks, definitely touches on a couple of things that we've heard already today, specifically around, I guess, what farmers in our community wanted when it comes to transparency, but also importantly, what customers wanted and how the drivers behind customer behavior and customer buying are affecting both whether or not people are getting certified and also how interested our community are in finding some sort of small scale solutions in communities as small as individual markets. So I'm sure that many of you will remember that around last year, there was an article on Marketplace around reselling within markets. And this caused a significant amount of distrust across a number of markets in Toronto, both in vendors and in customers. And so this is something we really wanted to tackle head on and start looking at why customers were so concerned by this concept of reselling and why there was low trust between our vendors and their customers. And the main concern seemed to be that it wasn't easy to identify which farmers grew what and how they were growing it, despite the fact that, you know, over half of our 50 farmers are organic, that a good number of them are biodynamic, and that the rest have been visited by ourselves in the past. And despite the fact that everyone had, you know, either been visited by us or had third-party certifications, which we always push for people to have, there was that disconnect. And we really wanted to see how we could find a more simple method to get customers to understand who was growing what and how. If we can sling on to the next slide. So yeah, when we actually asked what customers want, we asked them a number of questions around the fact that, so was it that they specifically wanted organic farmers? Was it that they wanted biodynamic farmers? Was it that they wanted to see particular certification? And we actually found that the majority of customers just wanted transparency. It wasn't necessarily that they said, I only eat organic or I only eat biodynamic. It was just a case of saying, I'd like to be able to choose from across the market in the, you know, in the knowledge that I know what I'm getting. And they also wanted a system that supported all farmers. So as well as having some large farms within our market, we have a good number of vendors who have as little as 1 or 2 acres. And we also have a reasonable number of farmers who lease land, which has led to hurdles for them when they're on short leases in actually certifying organic, even though they follow organic practices. So as well as a system of signage that was fair to all farmers and allowed every farmer to get on board, they wanted it to be easy to understand so it doesn't alienate people who maybe aren't particularly au fait with the current regulations that we have, that it was easy to read, and it was something that was consistent across the market all year round, so that really whenever you dropped in and out of the market, it was clear on what you were buying. We want to skip across again.
Okay, I'm going to stop and start again because I think it just needs to do that. 1 second.
Oh.
Second. Okay, okay.
Okay, so if you can see this slide, this is the signage protocol that we've started using in our own market in the last 4 to 6 weeks. So we have broken out all of our farmers into one of 5 categories. Now, the first 3 categories you can see are certified organic, certified biodynamic, and MyPick. And you can see the short descriptions, which are actually listed around our market, our welcome point, so people know what these signs mean. Now, these first 3 signs, you need to have your certification paperwork with you at the booth, as you always have needed. But what this means is that from a distance, you can see clearly how vendors are categorized. And that's something that customers have really got on board with. And then if you look at the 2 on the right, the verified vendor sections, these are the signs that we give to vendors who currently aren't certified organic or biodynamic and don't have any third-party certification. And the way that being a verified vendor works is that we set up a round robin of inspections as a peer review, so that no farmer is ever reciprocally inspecting each other. And if there isn't a farmer within an hour's drive, we will go and do the inspection. This simply means that they have been visited once a season and that we have taken an inventory of what they have planted in terms of either acreage or square feet across their property, so that we have a list of what's going to come from their farm each year, so that if a customer does ask and says, have you been to visit them, we're able to, with confidence, say, yes, this vendor has been verified by either a community member or by ourselves as a market team, and we can vouch for the fact that they are growing on their property and that they're a primary producer who's bringing their own produce to market. The last one on the right is something that we are currently in testing with, which is this idea that as part of the verified vendor process, we've been working with Local Food Plus, the certification body, to translate their old inspection process into an inspection that can be done by a farmer for another farmer, or likewise, so that for no cost, should you wish to show that you are following conservation practices, reducing energy use, providing animal welfare, you can receive a no-cost verification for your produce. And that's something that, while we're not fully out of the pilot stage with, and we have had a few hurdles and we'll need to continue to iterate that, we think that at least within our own market, that's a nice way to provide a no-cost certification for somebody who may be facing the challenges that have already been discussed around cost within small-scale producers. We can skip across again. So when we set up this pilot group, we worked with 15 farmers out of our 40 to 50 primary producers, and 70% of them said they were happy to travel up to 2 hours or 2.5 hours in total to inspect another farmer, which seemed to be an indicator of both how seriously this pilot group take the fact that they want to make sure no one's slipping through this net and not being held accountable, and the fact that people are really interested in learning more about other small scale producers. They want to be there for a couple of hours. They want to learn. They want to, trade knowledge and become, not just better, more connected community members, but also learn from each other. And we also found that, despite the fact that only 50% of respondents were comfortable visiting and expecting any farm off the bat, that 80% of them, when you added them up, were happy to visit any farmer as long as they had extensive instructions and supporting documents from us to ensure that they could do that inspection properly. We did also have a small number of participants who didn't feel comfortable assessing a farmer producing different products than themselves. And so what we make sure to do is that whenever we match farmers for an inspection, that they are not only given the tools that they need, but at no point ever going to a property where they feel like they don't have the skills to carry out an effective peer review. And we can skip again. So what happens during a visit? So if you are a farmer, 2 to 4 weeks before you are due to do an inspection, we match you with another farmer who's within your area and farming and producing products that you feel happy going out and inspecting. You have 7 days between the two of you to decide on a date and a time for that visit and to inform us as a market team, at which point we send across an information pack to the farmer, which carries a short guide on how to do an inspection. So what you should be looking for, what you should be asking farmers, and then a document that you can capture all the details about their produce on. So it gives you rows of square footage, acreage, number of plants, etc. And then as you go down that, you will inspect their farm. And if you see, X rows of a certain variety of tomato, you will write that down and you will go through all of their varieties of tomatoes, and then onto their varieties of peppers, onto the varieties of root crops. And then after the inspection, you have a week to send that across to us so that we have a record of everything that that farmer is carrying that year. And an attestation just to say that, you have, which is effectively a pledge to say that you've been to the farm, you've seen this, and everything that you, to the best of your knowledge, is accurate. The Local Food Plus, the added on verification process, you receive a set of protocols from Local Food Plus, which are broken down into 9 different protocols based across full variety of crops that can be grown in Ontario. And they are pretty much a questionnaire. Each one's between 30 and 60 questions that are yes or no based on observations of both the farm and the crops, which then equally have to be signed off with an attestation to say that as far as you are aware, everything in there is accurate and signed off by yourself. Once that paperwork reaches us, we will review it, and then the farmer will receive one of the 5 signs. And the aim is to do this seasonally, so once in the summer, once in the winter, moving forward, so that everyone is always up to date. And we can skip one last time. So we found that it's increased trust amongst farmers, and that our farming community seems to be much more comfortable with the fact that everyone is now being held accountable for what they grow. And we've seen that there's been opportunities for learning and knowledge sharing. We've found that over 75% of our public have said that this has improved their confidence in what they're buying. It means that they're buying more. It means that they're going to vendors who they might not have gone to before because they didn't have that interpersonal connection and understanding of someone's products. And most importantly, I think our audience have really appreciated the fact that instead of having the accusations last year around farmers markets and shutting up shop, that we've really been proactive about isolating what their main concern is, which is transparency, and then working quickly and cheaply to find a solution that works for both farmers and consumers at a scale as small as markets. Because while most of our consumers understand that there are things like, biodynamic certification and organic certification, which we will tell them in our opinion are the gold standard because they are, certifications that are led by experts, that as a small food hub, we are shouldering some of that burden and responsibility for our food system. And it's something that, from the sounds of it, they would like to see more often in more places. And we can skip again. So I guess what happens next for us is we will be debriefing across the next 2 or 3 months with our farmers and working out how we can improve this process. We've also looked at a few other ideas, such as having basically citizen inspectors, so people who are long-term visitors to the farmers market who would like to volunteer to go out on inspections with adequate training. That's something we might look at. We're also going to look at firming up this relationship with Local Food Plus and seeing if it's something that we can pass on to other farmers markets. And I think also just acknowledging that this is something that's very much in its inventory or in infancy. It's a peer review model that we've come up with because we felt like transparency wasn't being really put across within our market, but we also accept that it's far from a complete program. And we're going to continue sort of experimenting with this to see if we can increase how, intensely we are inspecting without increasing the burden on farmers, because as we know, small producers are very busy people, and we're already asking a great deal of them to spend this 3 or 4 hours going on an inspection, which we're very grateful for, but we want to make sure that we're making that as convenient as possible so more vendors want to get on board with this peer review model.
Okay, thanks so much, Kim. So we're a little bit behind schedule. I'm going to turn it over to Dave, and then we'll hear from him on the local organic ProCert program, how that's working. Also about any thoughts he has on the national level changes. And then we're going to open it up to questions. So if participants want to start sending in questions now, we'll take note of those and open it up to each of you later. Okay, so go ahead, Dave.
Okay, so I'll talk briefly about our program. So back in 2015, when those discussions started on national level about the small scale operators, we decided to do a pilot project at ProCert, which is kind of similar to what they're doing in BC, but we structured it a little bit different. So our certification program is with an emphasis on verification of compliance to the Canadian organic standards without review for compliance to the organic products regulation. Okay, so the program is not ISO 17065, so it's a creation of our own, but we still verify everything that's needed to be verified. So in order for an operator to qualify, we limited to operators that are under 10 acres, that operators that produce crops, and that the products are sold only within the province and sold directly to the end user. Because what we didn't want is our products ending up in the hands of distributors or trying to be used in products in compliance with the OPR, okay, which happens once in a while in some of these programs. And also, it must be in the province where there's no provincial regulation. So actually, the only province where we had some clients was in Ontario. The cost of the program, we kept it very simple. We wanted to see whether, cost was a factor and so forth. So we said the cost is $300 per year and an additional $50 in the year where they're being inspected. So the program is based on an inspection every 2 years. Unless they were doing many major changes or we needed to go back, we would not inspect them every year. So really the schedule was once every 2 years. So some of the items we didn't include in the program, so there was no 15-month wait for certification, no yearly inspection, less prescriptive product audit requirements, no complaint verification, no reporting to accreditors or CFI. Okay, so these things eliminated a little bit of bureaucracy, a little bit of cost. Although our $300 cost, just to let you know, the program did not actually cover our basic cost for the program. That's not a reflection about how much it actually cost to certify them if you were to account for all the labor and actually the true cost. So if we look at our program, when we started in 2015, we had 4 operators who signed up to the program. In 16, we had 17. In 17, it went up to 18. And this year, we've dropped to 9. Okay, so a few operators went to the core program to be able to market their product and use the logo and so forth. But most who quit are for the same reasons that are highlighted in the survey, which is paperwork and records and also cost, despite the fact that I'm not sure you can get actually cheaper than $300 per year. So when we look in terms of factors which are contributing to the cost of certification for the small scale operators, and when we talk about small scale operators, it's what Tony said, which is it's not a function of how small they are, it's more of a function of how diversified they are and the number of products they have. Okay, so you're talking about small operators that say 5, 10, even 20 acres, but will have, you know, between 20 and 100 different types of crops. And some of the costs which goes into this, essentially our biggest cost is government oversight, okay, which include the ISO and all of that. And because not just the cost we have to pay for it to get the accreditation, but essentially it's the constant reporting, and then, you know, all the investigations that we get from CFIH with their testings program, and then the auditing of files when we get audited. And they always find issues with the small scale farm. Okay, so they're never inspected properly, they're never audited properly, they're never happy with them. Okay, that's because they're very complicated and you have all these different things happening, and it's nearly impossible to get it all right. The other thing is the fact that we have, as a certifying body, have to list each individual specific product on the certificate. And we must make sure that all these products are certified before they're actually put up for sale, okay? Which means, and we know that, you know, small scale operators in the garden, the plan changes, and then, well, sometimes you decide to plant some crops at the last minute and so forth. And all of that oversight to keep the certificate current is a lot of work. The other issue is at inspection time, requirements to have yield estimates on each crops at the time of inspection. That's a constant source of headaches, and just trying to estimate some of these are nearly impossible. The requirements for mass balance audits on products and the lack of records due to the fact that a lot of the sales are cash sales or no particular records are sold at farmers market. That's very difficult at cost. Review of multiple inputs, we've already discussed the input issue. Seed reviews. Okay, sometimes you could get bogged down to a few seeds where there was no documentations or records and so forth. The yearly inspection issue. And then there's also the whole issue about the organic plan verification. Okay, so the operator must have an organic plan, which is fairly detailed, it makes sense, we're able to be audited, and then we have to verify the plan and the modifications of that plan through the years. So, and then there's a whole question when it comes to auditing, the question, and this has been kind of asked of the accreditors and so forth, and the issue has not been resolved. And part of the issue has to do with what do we actually certify? Okay, so, and what do we actually audit? So if you have an operator which is marketing products at the farmer's market, the products are not labeled, the products are sold as such, are they really selling products in accordance with the OPR or under the OPR? And the question is, can you actually audit those? So do you certify what is being grown by the operator, or do you certify what is being sold by the operator? And if you cannot audit what's being sold, then essentially, how does this all work? Okay, so, and these are open-ended questions where there is no answer. Okay, so we're not going to try to find answers today. And these have been asked for a long time. So exactly what needs to be changed within the regulation is probably, you know, though you have to look into a system which will allow us to do some auditing, some review, and decide what is important to be verified when it comes to these specific type of operators, okay, which are pretty unique into what they're doing. So yeah, so I don't have any specific solutions to give you other than the fact that essentially these are complex operators. So actually from a time perspective and cost perspective on the CBs, they're probably one of the most labor intensive. Okay. So, and that contributes to the cost.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So we are running out of time. I would like to, I know Cameron, are you still there? Okay. Cameron has had to leave briefly. Oh, are you
I'm
still-
here for 2 or 3 more minutes.
Okay, I was going to say, if there are any questions for Cameron before he has to leave, I would love to open that up to everyone. I have a question for Cameron, which is, do you think that the model that you're working with at Evergreen Brickworks could be replicated at other farmers markets? And if it were, let's say, like, is it something that could be scaled out? And what would the challenges be there?
So, a couple of things. I think it could work under a number of circumstances. First of all, this is definitely something that is it's an added extra to a market that has always taken certification really seriously. So that we have a relatively curated community of vendors who, by and large, are very committed to both transparency and sustainable farming. Now, the other thing is that we run our farmers market with an advisory committee as opposed to a board. So while we meet twice or 3 times a year with the whole community to discuss the direction the market is moving, this process was something that we decided we were going to implement, and that was a goal that was decided on by Evergreen. I know other farmers markets where they have a board, where the board is made up of vendors, have struggled to increase transparency because if your board is staffed by farmers who are not following organic or sustainable principles and don't see the need to, and would see greater transparency as potentially harmful to their businesses, then it's very hard to get that off the ground. So I understand we do have some unique benefits to our model. That being said, I think there are plenty of brilliant farmers markets out there in Ontario who do take sustainability seriously, and we'd be more than happy to chat about how they could start from the grassroots themselves, these little inspection processes that, if nothing else, prove that you can do it with, you can find a level of transparency with little budget and little staff. And I think that's important when sometimes there's this preconception that sustainability and transparency are incredibly expensive and incredibly complex. We want to sort of approach it from a community perspective, and I think anyone can do that.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, there are 2 questions for you. One is from Jill Baxter and one's from Rochelle.
Okay, I see them.
I can ask Rochelle to ask her own question, but from Jill Baxter, it says, you mentioned that other farmers can inspect farmers twice per year. Are these farmers certified organic? The farmers traveling to inspect the farms?
So the members of our pilot group, some are biodynamic, some are certified organic, and then we have some that aren't certified organic. And the really important thing to note there when you look back at the signs is, for 3 of those signs, the certified organic, the certified biodynamic, and the MyPick, we also need to see their third-party paperwork. So the inspection we're doing isn't to say they're organic, it's to say that not only are they organic, but we can say that we've seen everything growing in the ground at their farm. For the verified vendors, likewise, like, a farmer doesn't have to be certified organic because they're not going there to determine whether or not they're organic or biodynamic. The certification is what does that, which they have to have at their booth. The purposes of this one is to say that at the very least we've seen what they have at their stall growing in the ground. So they don't have to be certified organic to go and do visits. They just have to be one of our vendor community.
Right. And they, I guess, would be volunteering to do that? Or...
Yes, and it's reciprocal in as much as to be inspected, you have to inspect somebody else, but it's a round-robin approach where no 2 farmers visit each other in order to remain impartial. And if they do have any concerns on a visit, that's where I myself would go out and visit. So they're never in the position of, calling out another farmer personally.
Okay. Rochelle, did you want to ask your question?
Mute me. Okay. Yeah, Cameron, and it's just perception. So I understand what you're saying in terms of what LFP represents in your system, but what's consumers' perceptions of LFP? Do they think it equates to organic?
So I don't think they do, because when they do ask us, we clearly we'll state that it's not, and we know that the people behind LFP don't equate themselves to organic either. They see it as a very different protocol. I think what I would say to that, though, is that There will be a slight crossover with customers there, and I think that's partially because there is a lack of clarity often, not just between LFP and organic, but between LFP and organic and beyond organic, all those issues that we've talked about today. So we do our best by trying to very prominently sign what those 5 different things are, but we also accept there's a limited amount we can do against the greater background of certification and the confusion that customers sometimes have in a world where there seems to be an increasing number of certifications, all potentially similar and overlapping, but in that same sense, not necessarily clear where the boundaries are between each one.
Are there any other questions for Cameron before I let him go? I think he needs to get onto another call. Okay, thanks, Cameron.
No worries. And all I would say is it's been great to chat today. And this is something that, you know, it's in its infancy. We're looking to learn. We know that there are things that need to be improved with this, as with anything that's, you know, in its starting stages. So if someone wants to chat about this another time, or you're interested in it, or you have a thought at a later time of how we could improve it, we'd love to hear.
All right, thanks, Cameron.
Thank you ever so much, folks.
So we have another question here. First of all, I wanted to, so there are 2 questions. One is from Frederick Miner. He's wondering about aquaponics. And Frederick, I would like to get into that. We have a whole separate webinar on aquaponics that I think you're going to be involved in as well. But just to quickly address your question, maybe Dave, you can address it. What does it mean for new aquaponic growers? How should they be included in the future?
Well, aquaponics, as far as CFI has told us, aquaponics is going to start, is it January 5th, where products are going to be able to be certified under the aquaponic program. And it's going to be the same procedure as certifying under the core.
Under the Canadian organic regime, right?
Yes.
There will be, and I'm going to go to this actually. I'll pull this up. There are upcoming events. So October 10th, there will be a whole webinar dedicated to discussing aquaponics and hydroponics and how they fit into the organic regulation given new standards. So I hope that people who are interested in that can come to that. There's another question here. Dave, this is from Kristen, did you find that the small scale category saved ProCert funds in the end, having fewer small farms certified? Or do you think they were farms that wouldn't have considered the regular process?
Well, let me see. We haven't done the actual cost comparison, but where we save a lot on the program is on risk, in that there's no oversight. I mean, the operators are strictly under our own oversight, as opposed to be under the government oversight. So there's no reporting, there's no particular audit, nobody looking over our shoulder. In other words, we certify, we deal with it, and then we're done. Okay, so it does remove a lot of costs, but we didn't do the dollar figure cost or whatever. It's easier to deal. They're definitely easier to certify and to deal with under our local program than if we're certifying under the core. Because under the core, there is no leeway. You have to go through everything, and you have to make sure everything is working perfectly. And
do you think that that program would be sustainable in the long run if there were no regulation in Ontario for ProCert?
Possibly. I mean, it's something that the program it's less demanding than the core, and probably makes more sense for if you're just doing local selling yourself, selling at farmers market, because like I said, the core program does not really address those operators.
I don't see any other questions coming in. Please send in your questions. We have 2 more minutes. I have a question for all of the panelists, which is it, so if we're considering regulation in Ontario, do you think that we should have a provincial accreditation body like in BC, so that we don't have to worry about the ISO piece and the oversight that Dave's talking about? Or do we need the accreditation piece in order to have our own provincial program. That be government. Rochelle, do you have any thoughts? Hold on. There you go.
Of course, I'm going to say yes, because it works so well in BC. But again, you need a program that works for Ontario. But I do think it's very true. You have a lot of producers that sell direct, and finding a solution that works for everybody is great. The only thing is there are so many certification bodies that function in Ontario. So I think you actually have to survey the certifiers and see how many are willing to do small scale certification and would consider creating a regional program, unless you're going to anoint one and then you're going to have an accreditation board to oversee one certification body doing this. There's some logistics that has to be figured out. We have 8 certification bodies that we're dealing with, and all of them at some level offer low risk. So it's cost effective to do it, and it's bundled. And Dave's very right. It's easier if you don't have to follow the ISO structure, but at $300, I'm pretty sure it's not self-sustaining. But again, the numbers aren't there for you to actually crunch. But that's why I know it's about 400, 500 here for the low risk people annually.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on that? Tony?
I think it's certainly something worth having a look at. But I think, I guess one of the things that always concerns me is, can we work with what we've already got in terms of existing certifying bodies? And if Ontario brings in a regulation or says it wants to regulate organic at the provincial level, can we figure out a way that creates space for some of these other alternatives that doesn't mess up with the national regulation? So I'm certainly not opposed to it. And some of the things we were suggesting was, at the time of our committee, was creating sort of a provincial organization or body. But time has moved on, and as an organic movement, we've got limited enough resources and limited enough energy, so that you just want to make sure you're not duplicating and not creating sort of more work and spreading people too thin. So that's a really wishy-washy, ambiguous answer, but it's the best I can come up with on short-term, Carolyn.
Okay, I just want to ask, Thorsten Arnold is on the call, and I'm just opening it up for him to speak. You're now not on mute. Thorsten, do you want to just mention your piece about the European approach?
Yes, so thank you everybody for this very interesting talk. Especially I found Dave's and Cameron's elaboration of the problems of small processors produced in practical terms very interesting. So the European Union has just, I think, adapted an update to the organic standard, the European organic standards. And coming into effect in 2021, there will be 2 ways to basically reduce the burden of organics certification. The first one is that they allow for low risk designations for some farms, which only require a biannual inspection. And the second, which I find actually more interesting, is a group certification, where a group of farmers can sell through a single aggregator or venue, and all of their producers are then certified organic through this group inspection process. And I don't know about the technical details. What I do know is that the European Union will accept this type of certification now, not only in developing countries, but in any country of the world. So I could actually inspect in Ontario through this group certification process, and then sell an organic product into Europe and carry the label. My thought is, instead of trying to create a new system here that creates all kinds of equivalent difficulties later on, it would just make sense to me to really study those European solutions and check whether we can link into that system somehow. That would, on one hand, save us the equivalence work, and probably also the European people have put a lot of resources into working out some practicalities. And yeah, we already, like, if we just take something similar, then we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. Has anybody looked at that?
Okay, I'm gonna leave that for either Rochelle or Dave. Rochelle, you want to answer, and then we do.
Yeah. We already have group certification in Canada. It's embedded in the operation manual. The only restriction in the group certification protocol is in Canada, it's restricted to similar commodities, where in other countries, it could be mixed commodities. And that's one of the changes that needs to be reconsidered for the operating manual federally. But also the group certification has to have internal oversight. They have to have a certification system where they're actually inspecting every commodity, every member of their group. And that's where it's failed, because it usually involves a co-op model, and the overhead of inspecting all the members becomes exorbitant. And they also don't have the expertise internally. So it's not something that we can't do, it's something that people haven't opted for. And the low risk designation, yeah, it's totally possible, as I said earlier. It just has to be embedded in the operating manual for CFIA. And at this point, they have not introduced that concept.
Just before we finish, is the operating manual a regulatory document, or is it a
Yes. Well, it's a guideline, but it's it's the functioning. There it is. Dave's holding it up. So yeah, if you, it's very tedious. It lays out how the conformity verification bodies have to function, how the CBs have to function, how an inspection has to take place, frequency, and the group alternatives and stuff like that. So yeah, that is a CFI official document that has to be paid attention to.
And so it would have to be changed by
Yeah.
IA?
Yeah, if you want these things, this is where, and you want it done federally. But again, if the sales are only within a province,
Right.
if this is where you're going to go and talk to CFIA about it, they're going to say that's not our problem. The low risk is not our problem in your province. If you're saying we want to do low risk across the country, then they'd have to have that discussion.
Right. Well, and I'm not sure that so that guideline would only apply for products that cross provincial borders. They would not include anything that says within the province you could do this.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I want to say thank you to all of you. I'm sorry that we've gone over a little bit. I want to respect everyone's time and say thank you. I think we've had an amazing group online here, and I hope that everybody who's been listening has some questions that they can take away. Feel free to follow up with any of your questions. We hope to get those elaborated on, and we will be releasing our report more broadly by October. And we hope to incorporate a little bit of this discussion into that. But just to reiterate, we do have other events coming up. So our whole webinar series is outlined here and on our website. Aquaponics, parallel production and transition, poultry and access to outdoors, and organic cannabis are on the lineup. You can find all of that at our website, Your Standards, Your Say, and COG will be publishing that as well on their website. And I do want to say that we're open to new webinar topics and looking for sponsors as well. Finally, October 2nd, we're going to have our Queen's Park Day here in Ontario, Organic Day at Queen's Park. And please, we'd love to have as many people as possible. We know it's not the right time of season for all farmers, but we do want to get those MPPs early on in their thinking process. So please look for that on our website as well. And thank you so much to everybody who participated.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks so much. All right, I'm going to end the meeting now. Thank you.